Hello and welcome back. My name is Nathan House and I am with the Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be appreciated. I have on the screen a map from that represents the story of Jephthah from Judges chapter 11 and Judges chapter 12. We're only going to be looking at Judges chapter 11. Nevertheless, you can still see and track some of the movement of Jephthah in the land of Israel. So as we read through the text, you can again refer back to this map as you like on your own. But kind of interesting just to note a few things. Jephthah's route from Tob to Mizpah. So here's Tob, here's Mizpah. Just to kind of show you just a few points that you are familiar with. Jerusalem would be down here in this area. So the time, if we were looking at New Testament times, of course, this is the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth is in here. This is the Jordan River. So you can see that Jephthah, he will be concerned with, he will be traveling from the east of the Jordan River over here in this area, as well as west of the Jordan River. And this was primarily, the majority of this on the west side is, of course, what would remain Israel through most of their history. But following the time of Joshua, when they went into the land, initially, this area over here was also given over to the Israelites, because if you remember, 3.5 of the tribes retained land on this side of the Jordan River. So again, we just kind of notice where Jephthah is and some of his journeys through the land of Israel. We're going to be in chapter 11. I'm going to go back over to this side. This is my comfort zone over here on this side. So I want to begin here in Judges chapter 11. I want to read the first 3 verses and just make some real quick observations about Jephthah. It says, "Now Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah, and Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when his wife's sons when they grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, 'You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman.' Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob." So that was on that map that I just showed you. He fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob, way up here. And then it says, "And worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out after him." So I also want to come back up here to chapter 10. When chapter 10 is ending, the Israelites were looking for someone to deliver them. Who is the man who will begin to fight against the Ammonites? He shall be head over all the inhabitants of Gilead. So the question at the end of chapter 10 is answered in chapter 11. Who is the man who will begin to fight against the Ammonites? And so, just as we see in the book of Judges, there is a cycle of a deliverer that God sends, that God uses. And so here again is another judge, someone that God uses, someone that God will use to deliver his people. So you're looking at the first 3 verses. What are some things we can learn concerning Jephthah? Well, wrong screen. What are some things that we can learn concerning Jephthah? And by the way, this slide, probably out of place. This slide actually represents what we'll see about Jephthah in a minute. But real quickly, let's look at this. I'm kind of going out of order a bit, so bear with me and forgive me. But so this is the area where Jephthah himself was from. If you're looking at the book of Judges, different judges kind of judged and delivered in certain areas and certain locations within the ancient area of Israel. And so a judge wasn't necessarily national over the whole area. Judges were more localized. And so don't begin to think that one judge ruled over the whole of Israel, because that's not really what we see in the book of Judges. Now, what did we see, again, going back to the original question from a moment ago? What did we learn about Jephthah from Judges chapter 11, verses 1 through 3? Well, we learned that he's a mighty warrior. The text makes that clear. He was the son of a prostitute. And so because of this, he was an outcast. His own family, of course, they would have been half siblings. They didn't want him around, so they drove him out, and he left and went into the land of Tob. And so what do we learn about him? Well, these things are all relevant. If we're just going to kind of collect some information about this man Jephthah, these things go into our collection of information. What are we learning about him? A mighty warrior, son of a prostitute, an outcast in his family. And so again, let's go back to the text here and let's read verses 4 through 6. So again, Jephthah fled from his brothers. What do we see? Again, he was a mighty warrior, son of a prostitute. He fled from his brothers. So all those things that I already pointed out. Now we come to verse 4. After a time, the Ammonites made war against Israel. And when the Ammonites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the land of Tob, and they said to Jephthah, "Come out and be our leader, that we may fight against the Ammonites." And so again, they didn't want him around because he was the son of a prostitute. He was an outcast, but he was a mighty warrior. And so now here is this war, war that's looming, right? The Ammonites are there. They're making war against Israel. They're making war against Jephthah's family. So Jephthah's family reaches out to him, and now they want him. And so here we have Jephthah, and they're reaching out to Jephthah here. And we come down here, let's pick up in verse 9. Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "If you bring me home again to fight against the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, I will be your head." And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "The Lord will be a witness between us, if we do not do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and leader over them. And Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord at Mizpah. So what do we learn about Jephthah if we're looking here at these verses? Well, what kind of stands out to me is that the word Yahweh keeps occurring. And two of these three occurrences are from the mouth of Jephthah, or actually I should say this one's from the mouth of Jephthah. This is from the narrator of the book of Judges. And he also attributes something of Yahweh to Jephthah. But again, Jephthah says, "The Lord gives them over to me." So it's interesting to me to note Jephthah seeing some of these things as from the Lord. Then the narrator of the book of Judges, or the writer of the book of Judges, I should say, Jephthah spoke all of his words, says, before the Lord at Mizpah. And I find that interesting. And you see, when you're looking at the story of Jephthah, this is one of the most hotly debated Old Testament stories, as we'll see in a minute, that Jephthah makes a vow or a promise that becomes very hard to know what happened, or some people say it's hard to know. Whatever the case, it's a very debated passage. What I want you to see, though, just for this moment, is Jephthah is crying, as Jephthah is referring back to the Lord. He brings his words before the Lord. If you come to back to chapter 10, the people of Israel, they were not following the Lord. We talked about this last time. The people of Israel, it says, again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and they served the Baals, the gods, all these false gods. So it's interesting to me to note what I see as a contrast between the people of Israel. They are forsaking Yahweh and serving the false gods. That is extremely clear. And again, go back and watch the last video, but it is extremely clear that they are forsaking Yahweh and following false gods. And yet, when we look at this individual, Jephthah, he brings up Yahweh. He brings up Yahweh. And again, if you go back to chapter 10, it says the people said to the Lord, they cried out to the Lord because they're in a bad place now, right? They're being oppressed by their enemies. We have sinned, do what seems good to us. So watch this. So they put away their foreign gods from among them and served the Lord. And he became impatient over the misery of Israel. So it's Yahweh here who becomes impatient. They cry out, who's going to be a leader for us? But Jephthah seems to me to be a bit of a contrast to the people of Israel. In my opinion on this might be a little bit different than others. And really, bear with me anyways, all right? But Jephthah seems to be in contrast to the people of Israel. He seems to cry out to the Lord. He speaks his words before the Lord at Mizpah. So I kind of find that interesting. And so what do we learn about Jephthah from these verses? Again, he uses the covenant name of God numerous times. He recognizes the Lord there in verse 9. He recognizes the Lord as the source of victory. And again, contrast that with chapter 10, verse 6, with the people of Israel. And he, as we're going to see, if you come down to chapter 15, Jephthah begins to rehearse the history of Israel and God's involvement in the history of Israel. He begins to tell the king of the Ammonites, so he's going to go to the Ammonites and he's going to try to make peace, not war. And so he's going to try to rehearse to the king of the Ammonites Yahweh and his role and his hand in the life and the nation of the people of Israel. So he's knowledgeable of the Lord. And he says, again, notice what he says, thus says Jephthah, verse 16, when they came out of Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea. They came to Kadesh. This is all Jephthah's words. He's rehashing the history of Israel. Israel then sent messengers, blah, blah, blah. They journeyed through the wilderness. And then it comes down to verse 21. look at what Jephthah says to the king of the Ammonites. And the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel. Look at again what Jephthah says concerning Yahweh. Yahweh is the God of Israel. He gave Sihon and all his people into the hand of Israel, and they defeated him. So Israel took possession. Then we come down to verse 23. So then the Lord, Yahweh, God of Israel, dispossessed the Ammonites. Verse 24. Jephthah then asks the king of the Ammonites a question. If your God gave you something, wouldn't you think it's yours? So he says, will you not possess what Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess? And all that Yahweh, our God, has given us, we will possess. So all through here, Jephthah rehashes the history of Israel. He rehashes the Lord, not just God. He doesn't use a generic name for God. He uses the covenant name for God. He rehashes what Yahweh does in the life of the Israelites. And then in verse 27, he says that I therefore have not sinned against you, and you do me wrongly by making war on me. Yahweh, let him be the judge. So again, it's very interesting to me to see over and over how Jephthah refers to God. Then it says in verse 29, then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah. And again, in the book of Judges, this does not necessarily mean that the individual was a righteous individual. I would say that Samson was not an overly righteous individual, and yet this phrase is used of Samson three times, I believe, in chapter 13 and chapter 14. So Jephthah has the Spirit of the Lord upon him. Gideon had the Spirit of the Lord upon him. You can go back to chapter 3, verse 10 and see, I believe it's Othniel that has the Spirit of the Lord upon him. So the Spirit of the Lord is given upon judges in the book of Judges, not necessarily because they were righteous people or God approved of what they were doing, but the Spirit of the Lord came upon them to give them victory. And that might be through the Gideon battle, like Gideon's. It might be through tremendous superhuman strength, like Samson. But here it does say the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and it is worth noting. But then it says this, and this is where this story of Jephthah becomes very challenging. Jephthah makes a vow to Yahweh and says, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be Yahweh's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over. The Lord gave them into his hand. So again, we see the Lord being with Jephthah. But when Jephthah returns home, his daughter comes out of the house, and Jephthah remembers his vow, and he says, I made a promise. You've brought me very low. You have become the cause of trouble for me because I have opened my mouth to Yahweh, and I cannot take back my vow. So then the daughter says to him, look at what the daughter's words are. So again, the daughter raised in the house of Jephthah says, you have opened your mouth to Yahweh. She doesn't say Chemosh or other false gods or Baal. You have opened your mouth to Yahweh. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that Yahweh has avenged you. So she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Leave me alone for 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for look at what she's weeping for, my virginity. So he said, go. He sent her away for 2 months, and she and her companions, and wept for her virginity. Then she comes back, and the father says, he does to her according to the vow that he made. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. So again, I think it's worth noting what is wept here. Her virginity is wept. She had never known a man. And so let me just kind of lay it out. This vow, what was vowed? What did Jephthah do? Really, it falls in 2 lines. Jephthah vowed to sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever came out of his house. And that means, according to some, that Jephthah must have sacrificed his daughter as a burnt offering. And again, that kind of makes sense as a straightforward reading of the text, which I think it's a reasonable thing to read it and understand it that way. It wouldn't be uncommon for people of this time to offer up sacrifices to false gods. It was certainly the case that there were numerous gods that burnt offerings were a part of their worship. So those are things that are kind of straightforward. When you read verse 31 in a straightforward way, it seems to indicate that that's the case, that she was going to be offered as a burnt sacrifice. Again, the spiritual leadership in the book of Judges is extremely questionable. so it wouldn't necessarily fall outside of the realm of possibility in the book of Judges. The other side of the argument is that what was wept, what the vow was, is the vow was that whatever comes out of my house will either be burnt or given to the Lord, given wholly to the Lord. And what might that mean? Well, it might mean in this case that his daughter is given wholly to the Lord, in the sense that she was just like Samuel, right? Samuel was given to the Lord as to serve the Lord, that she was given a lifelong sentence, if you will, of chastity, that she was going to live her life as a virgin. And that seems to fit, I think, what's happening here in verse 37 through 39. And so I think that is a reasonable conclusion. When I read the story of Jephthah, Jephthah seems to be a decent man, well acquainted with the writings in the history of Israel, with the writings of Moses. He would have certainly known that the Lord Yahweh thought human sacrifice was detestable. The text of Leviticus chapter 27, verses 1 and following, seems to indicate that there could be a way to get out of a vow. So would not Jephthah possibly have known of that? So I don't really have a hard answer. I tend to lean towards the fact that I think that the vow was her virginity at this point. That's what he vowed for her. If it had been a clean animal, he could have sacrificed it. If it had been an unclean animal, he shouldn't have sacrificed that either. But I believe that what he does is makes a vow concerning his daughter. You look at, again, his character. He seems to be a man, I think, of integrity. Some would disagree with me on this, but I believe he seems to be a man of integrity. One such question becomes verse 3, that worthless fellows collected around Jephthah. And perhaps that does mean people of bad character, but perhaps also it means something else. For example, note this, the Hebrew phrase denotes essentially disinherited or disenfranchised men, not necessarily immoral or criminal. So just like Jephthah was an outcast, perhaps those who gathered around him were outcasts. Some other scholars then say when Jephthah goes out, that means he's going out raiding and pillaging. Well, the text doesn't say that, so it's a bit of an assumption. So perhaps these men that are following him are worthless in the sense that he was worthless. He was worthless to his family. He was kicked out just like perhaps these men were. They were perhaps disinherited, disenfranchised. Such might be good men thrown into hard times, or they could be evil men. But empty denotes their social standing, not their character. So again, kind of puts perhaps a different perspective on verse 3. Also concerning verse 31, where it says here in verse 31, go back to that text. Verse 31, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Another possible scenario has that verse meaning I will offer it or I will vow it to the Lord. And again, here's another comment. The exact sequence of his statements, talking about in verse 31, so vital to the understanding of the vow, is given here. So here is the literal translation from the Hebrew from these gentlemen. If you indeed put the sons of Ammon in my hand, and then it shall be that one that comes out of the doors of my house to meet me upon my return in peace from the sons of Ammon, and he or it shall become Yahweh's, or I will offer up it as a burnt offering. So he shall become Yahweh's, or I will offer it as a burnt offering. That's very different, and or are very different here, correct? And again, some scholars would reject this translation. Some would say this is trying to sanitize the scriptures to make them more palatable. And I'm not trying to sanitize them. I don't think the book of Judges is a very sanitary book. It's a brutal book. But I'm also not trying to assume the worst in an individual who I seem to see some good in it. Having said all that, you could disagree with me. That's really not my point today. Okay, it is to look at it and at least introduce this to you. But there is a lesson in this story, nevertheless. Whatever happens here, whatever he did, whatever the vow was he made, there is a lesson. And here is the lesson: that his vow was rash. He either sacrificed his daughter or he pledged her to a life of virginity, of giving herself to the Lord without her consent. Whatever the case, his vow was rash. And so there is definitely a lesson there for us, that there are warnings in Scripture about us giving rash vows, rash promises. There's warnings for us in Scripture that when we make a promise, that we need to keep that promise. And Jephthah does keep his promise, whatever that was. And I'm hoping it's the one that I like to believe, you know. But notice these two verses real quickly, and you could, of course, share many other passages as well. But notice what Solomon writes in Proverbs 20. It is a snare to say rashly, it is holy, and to reflect only after making vows. So the point here is don't be rash in saying that this is holy, I'm giving it to the Lord, or whatever the vow is. Don't be rash in making it, and only after making it reflect on it and say, wow, I wish I hadn't given that vow. Have you ever made a vow that you've regretted, a promise you've made? What did you do in that case? Did you keep your vow? And so again, there is a lesson in to not be rash in making vows. Here's Solomon again, Ecclesiastes chapter 5. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it. Why not? Because he has no pleasures in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow. Look at the wisdom of Solomon. It's better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. There is absolutely a lesson for us here. There is an application for us that we be careful with the promises we make, the vows we make, the commitments we make. We don't want to be people that are not men and women of our word. You know, when we make a vow or a promise and we don't keep it, it is a reflection on our integrity. When we make a promise or a vow, we need to be people that keep that promise. Whatever we have said, whatever we have vowed, we keep it because it honors God. It doesn't honor God, and he has no pleasure when we do not keep our own words. Thank you guys. You guys go ahead and get into that study a little more and make your own decision concerning the nature of Jephthah's vows. You guys have a great day. God bless.